Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Spellbinders has a new release this month. It's the Mirrored Arch release, and it has some really cool things in it. So this is the Luxe Backdrop and Border Embossing Folder, and I love how there's a die that goes with that border. There is the Mother and Father's Day sentiments, Betterpress plates, as well as coordinating dies. There is the Mirrored Arch Blooms press plate, and there's a sentiment as well as the floral outline. There is the Mirrored Arch Nested Sprigs, and this one has several different Betterpress plates in it that you can use all together or separately. And then there's the coordinating Mirrored Arch die set. So I'll be using all of these throughout the video. And I will be coming out with a video that just uses the embossing folder in a bunch of different ways. But let's start with some traditional Betterpress. So I put the Mirrored Arch Blooms in my Spellbinders Betterpress Letterpress system. I'm using the Betterpress ink. And for this one, I always like when I get a new press plate to do it the traditional way first before I start to experiment and play with it. So I'm using some Betterpress paper, the Betterpress ink, and then I'm putting it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. And I love how pretty this looks. This is going to be great for doing a bunch of different coloring techniques. So for the next one, I wanted to try out the Mirrored Arch Nested Sprigs just to see how that one turned out in the Betterpress. And once again, I'm using the traditional ink. I'm using the gray Betterpress cardstock, and I did that for both the first one and this one. And then using the black Betterpress ink with it. I chose to do one of the inner Mirrored Arch pieces as well as the sentiment that comes with the set. I always like to ink it twice just to make sure to get any spot that I might have missed the first time. And I'm putting it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. And I absolutely love when you use the Betterpress paper, how you get such a deep impression with it. These are going to go great with those Mirrored Arch dies, and I'm going to do a bunch of layering with those as well as these press plate images. So now that we have these two here, let's do the sentiments. So I have that same gray Betterpress paper. I'm putting the sentiment set towards the top of where my paper would go. Just because of the size and the shape of this, I think I can get two out of one piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch cardstock. We're using the traditional ink here. I end up not using these sentiments in the cards. I do a set of sentiments, but I do them with different paper to coordinate with the cardstock that I used for that particular card. So now I turned my plate, my clear plate, 180 degrees, and I'm inking that press plate again and putting it through. And it doesn't work. And here's why it doesn't work. When you turn that plate 180 degrees, it doesn't quite line up. So it ended up going a little bit too close to the edge of the paper. And here I'm showing you how it normally is, and it's really hard to capture it on camera. So the first way was how you normally have it, and it lines up perfectly. But when you do it the second way here, and you can see it a little bit right here, it's off by about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. So then I ended up getting that press plate too close to the edge. So the first ones that worked properly and were aligned properly, I'm going to line up the coordinating dies, and I'm going to cut them out, and then I'm going to redo the other side, but I'm going to do it on the other side of the paper. Paper has two sides for a reason, and I love being able to just do it. You're never going to notice when you use these sentiments that there's a misprint on the other side. So if you ever have a problem lining up your sentiment dies with the press plates or foil plates, do it with your blade side down. I typically do die cutting with my blade side up, but I do find when I'm trying to line up coordinating sentiment and die set that does multiple ones, that paper kind of moves and shifts as you're putting it through the machine. So if you happen to have trouble with that, just change or flip your placement so that your paper is below your die and the blade is facing down. Now I went and redid these sentiments, did them on the other side, and it worked perfectly. I was able to get them fitting in there properly and able to cut them out. I did that off screen because I knew that this video was going to end up being quite long, and I really didn't want to keep you here forever. Now, this is another thing I love to just test out basically everything that comes in a new line. So I'm doing that with the the luxe background and border embossing folder. And I do use this embossing folder later, but I don't use it with this paper. This was just testing it out and trying it out and seeing how it looks. And I absolutely love this border. And this background is really cool. The embossing folder itself is kind of like getting a 2-for-1. Being able to have that border as well as that background is really kind of cool. So for that first Betterpress image, the mirrored arch blooms, I pulled out an old supply that I rediscovered a few months ago when cleaning up my craft room. It is some jewel tone chalks from Pebble Arts. And I love these chalks because they have a light shade and a dark shade of each color, so it makes it really easy to color different areas in. They also have tiny little pom-poms with them in different sizes, so you can choose which one works best for whatever size image you're coloring. Now I'm using the pom-poms to color it. I remember many years ago using a blender pen from a dye-based marker to use these as well. So if you wanted to try that, you could also try that as a way of coloring. I don't have a blender pen. The one that I had completely dried out. So I wanted to do it just this way. Now you'll see me pull the image up a little bit every once in a while, and I'm blowing off any chalk dust so that I don't accidentally get that on my hands and spread it all around. Now I obviously, as if you've seen any of my videos, really like pinks and purples and blues. So most of these flowers are going to be in those color tones. But you can do them whatever colors you want. I love the fact when you have different florals that you can get creative and just go crazy with them and really get creative with your coloring. So I'm keeping the florals fairly simple. I'm doing the light color over the whole thing, and then I'm taking the darker shade and doing the center of the flowers. I'm going to do that here on the hydrangea as well. I'm doing the lightest blue first, and then I will go back in with the darker blue just towards the center of the flower. And I'm not even changing the little pom-pom to color it. It's the same color, just a different tone. It's going to be totally fine. If you were to ever go back into the lighter tone, what I would do would be scribble this onto some cardstock or some printer paper or whatever, just to get more of that darker color off of there. But it doesn't usually last too long, so it's not really going to contaminate anything. And each one of these color duos in this chalk set have their own set of pom-poms, so you don't have to go and reuse them with different colors. Now, obviously, these flowers could be colored in any way you want, and in a little bit, I will do some watercoloring with them. You could also do them with Copic coloring or even dye-based marker coloring. Basically, however you love to color, you absolutely can do that with this. Just you want to choose your inks and your papers accordingly. Now these chalks have a little bit of a pearlescent finish to them, so the final card has a tiny little bit of shimmer to them. And I love the fact that they do have that bit of shimmer. Sometimes when you're coloring with chalks, because they're chalky, it can get a little bit flat. So having that pearlescent quality to them kind of takes that out of them. This top flower here that I am coloring, I think is a poppy, but I didn't want to do it the traditional red poppy color. We live in a house that had purple poppies when we moved in here, and I thought they were really, really pretty. Unfortunately, I gave a lot of the seeds away, and now we don't have poppies anymore. So this was a throwback to that, and I thought it was really, really pretty in this color. Again, poppies come in so many different colors, so you can go and play with them and have fun and really get creative with your coloring. You can see how quickly and easy it is to color these images in. They don't take a whole lot of time to them as well. The only thing with this particular set that I wish there was an outline die. I end up cutting this, or hand cutting, fussy cutting this particular image because I just liked it with the cut edge. And that's the only thing that I wish with this whole release, is that there was an outline die for this, but it's not too bad to cut. I mean, it's not the funnest thing in the world, but it's easy enough to do some fussy cutting around it. Now that I have the flowers done, I'm doing a little bit of the greenery. There's not a ton of leaves and greens in here, and I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the flowers. I'm going to go over the whole plate or whole area with the lightest green first, and then I'm going in with the darker green. I love the fact that the sentiment for this is separate, so you could swap it out for a different sentiment if you wanted. And the fact that the Mirrored Arch dies, there's 16 different sizes in that set, so it makes it really easy to play with these Betterpress plate sets and create a lot of different layered looks. The other thing that's really cool about the Mirrored Arch label dies is that the blade is right on the inner edge. So often, a lot of the nesting dies that I particularly have from Spellbinders, the blade is on the inside or the center of the metal backing, if you will. And sometimes it gets a little bit challenging to place things properly, but because the labels or the blade is on the inside edge, it makes it really easy to be able to pick and choose which one of them is going to be perfect for whichever layer you're using. So here I'm just doing the fussy cutting. If you've never done fussy cutting before, you do want to have a fussy cutting scissors or a detailed cutting scissors. These ones are cutter bees. I've had them for probably about 15 years now. They cut as well as when I first got them. I only use them for paper, and you'll see that my scissors position pretty much stays the same, but with my left hand, I'm regularly and constantly moving that paper around in order to cut the image. So when you're doing some fussy cutting, you want to be moving that paper and not moving the scissors as much. I did some of this on a time lapse because I realized this video was probably going to be fairly long, and I wasn't wrong. So there's a time lapse of cutting this background out. So it doesn't really take too long. It's doable, and I really do love the look of it with it die cut out or with it fussy cut out. So now that that piece is done, I'm going to put it on a piece of black cardstock because it really made those bright colors or those pastel colors, it really made them pop. So what you could also do instead of fussy cutting is you could take a marker and you could go and color with a marker around that whole edge, and you would get a similar look, and you would have to be able to avoid that fussy cutting. So now I'm taking some of the Mirrored Arch label dies, and I am picking and choosing which sizes I want, and I'm going to do a little bit of die cutting. I'm going to die cut that sentiment out of the center. After cutting out those flowers and putting it on black, I just thought it would look nicer with that sentiment with a black layer around it between the sentiment and the flowers. Now I cut the label, or I taped the label to that piece there in order to cut it out. That hole in the middle of the flowers is going to be totally fine. And you'll see I'm going to do that same thing with the black layer. I picked a black piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch cardstock. I'm going to take the label that I want to use for the layer, and I'm going to die cut that out of the center. When I go and glue that flower piece on there, you're never going to see that that part is open there. It's a good way to get some extra use out of your cardstock, and I've been doing this for years, and the only time anyone has ever known that I've done that is when I've told them. Most people can't even tell that you've done this at all. But it's a great way, like I said, especially for specialty cardstocks, to make them go a little bit farther. I did die cut a couple extra pieces of this black cardstock here. The black cardstock that I'm using is not particularly thick, so by die cutting a couple extras and layering them on top of each other, I'm able to thicken that up and just give it a little bit more of a substantial layer. And I'm doing that same thing with the sentiment in the center. I had some white scraps, so I'm using those for layering that up and just making that pop a little bit more. It's not enough so that it becomes really, really dimensional, but just enough to give it a little bit more of a substantial presence on the card. So I cut that black piece down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and then I'm going to layer all of these pieces together. I thought it looked a lot nicer being able to see the card base behind it as a bit of a frame. I also like to put a large acrylic block on my pieces while they're drying. It just keeps everything flat and gives good contact between the two pieces of cardstock while they're drying. I'm gluing everything together with some Barely Art glue, and it takes only a few minutes for that glue to really start to hold and grab. So you don't need to do that for very long. It doesn't need to be till everything is completely dried. The last step on here is I wanted to give it a little bit more life and a little bit more sparkle. Those chalks have a little bit of pearlescence to them, but I always love in the center of the flowers just a couple dots of stickles. In this case, I find, or most cases, I find less is more. I'm not putting large amounts of it, just enough just to add a touch of sparkle and center those flowers. So here is the finished card once everything is completely dried. We can set that to the side. And now I'm taking that piece that I created with the mirrored arch nested sprigs, and we're going to do some more layering. So I have more of the mirrored arch label dies. I'm picking and choosing which sizes I want for this, and I'm going to layer it with some matte silver cardstock. I'm not sure who this cardstock is from. I've had it for years, but it was perfect for the gray Betterpress cardstock with the black foiling or the black ink on it. And I really loved the look of the black, the silver, and the gray together. It kind of, even though there's some sprigs in there, it kind of gave it a little bit more of an almost masculine feel to it. So if you're looking for something to do for a masculine card, this is perfect. A little bit more monochromatic, but we're going to make it special with that silver paper. And then I'm also taking some pewter perfect pearls and I'm watercoloring in those sprigs. This is Betterpress cardstock, but it was able to easily handle this little bit of watercoloring. It's not a large area. I'm only filling in the pieces of these sprigs here. Another option would have been to do the Betterpress image with Versamark ink and then embossing it with silver, and then you would get that silver hint as well. But because I already had this done, this was a perfect way to tie in the silver for those layers. And it really doesn't take too long. If you've never used Perfect Pearls before, they are a mica powder that has a binding agent mixed right in that is activated by water. So simply adding water to it makes it a metallic paint. And if you add a lot more water to it, you're going to get a more transparent paint, but if you add little water to it and have a thicker paint, it's going to be more opaque and more metallic. So as I'm working, I'm trying not to add too much water to it. I kind of want the paint to look fairly similar and the same as each other. I don't want to see more transparent and more opaque. But you can see how quickly and easy it is to watercolor this image in, especially since I'm not changing colors or anything. I'm just doing the one color. So we're going to let that completely dry before we start to glue and layer everything together. And the one thing that I had intended to do and then didn't realize that I had forgotten to do till this card was done is what I had intended to do was doing some pressing with the black ink on this silver before die cutting it. And I was completely done when I realized that I didn't do that. I had intended to do that before die cutting it and everything. That's another way to add those images to the layers. Forgot to do it. It's okay. It's going to be totally fine. So I'm going to use that same Barely Art glue for gluing the layers together. And I do have some of the layers where I took some scraps of cardstock and added a little bit of extra layers behind it. Once again, just to give a little bit more presence, thickness, dimension to some of these layers. I'm not doing it with all of them. I'm only doing it with the layers that have the pressed images in them. And just like before, while I'm letting some of those layers dry, I am putting a large acrylic block on those pieces. Keeps everything flat, keeps good contact with the glue and the paper, frees up my hands to work on other things. And I do appreciate being able to continue to work rather than holding something down, waiting for glue to dry. Like I said, even though it only takes a few minutes, sometimes it's not so fun to be holding things down while you let things dry. So I love using these acrylic blocks for that. And I also love using this liquid glue because when you use liquid glues, you can move and shimmy things in place if you don't happen to get it perfectly the first time. Whereas some tapes, you have to get it perfectly the first time and you don't have that room to shimmy and move things in place. It's one of those things that sometimes you get it right down the first time, sometimes you don't, and it's nice to be able to have that freedom and that leeway in order to make sure that it's layered properly. Once all of those layers are completely dry, I'm using some silver lining crystal drops from Tonic, and I'm just adding little tiny drops around this Betterpress image. This one has, it almost looks like little nail heads or just tiny little circles. So I'm just putting these drops there. It's going to give them a little bit of extra dimension. It also is going to add just a bit of a different texture to that center. Another option would have been using those same perfect pearls to paint in this area, but I just thought these crystal drops would be perfect for this. And it happens to go fairly quickly. The hardest part about this is trying to make sure that all of those dots are in very similar size. But as you keep going, you'll notice that I do end up going a little bit faster as I'm working because you kind of get a bit of a rhythm going there. And once that is all completely done, we'll set that aside to dry. You can see when I lift this up to the camera how those crystal drops just add a really nice dimension to that. So for our third card, we're going to take the Mirrored Arch Nested Sprigs press plate, and I'm using a peeled paint distress pad, and I'm going to ink that up, put it on my base plate for my Platinum 6 machine, and I'm going to do some embossing of the press plates. I love doing the embossing, especially with inking, because you get so much pillowy dimension from it. And I thought this one, because it's a lot of greenery, would be perfect in greens. So I have that one done there. I'm going to clean this piece off, and then I'm going to also do another one with the Mirrored Arch Blooms press plate, but this time I'm going to use a gold pad, and I'm going to do it on some black cardstock. Now the one thing with this is when I ink these pads, I get some on the background of my base plate for my Spellbinders. You do want to make sure to clean that off, because when we go to put this the rubber embossing mat, that presses everything down, and if you don't clean off your background, you're going to get some ink on the areas that are the open space. So you don't want to leave that ink there. You do want to move it and clean that off. But look how beautiful that gold ink embossed on the black cardstock is. It looks so pretty. I absolutely love how that turned out. Another option would have been to use Versamark and then gold embossing powder. However, you wouldn't have had the pillowy dimension you get from doing the embossing. And by that, I mean the dry embossing in the die cutting machine rather than the heat embossing of the ink. It's always so confusing when there's two similar terms that mean something completely different. So after this is embossed, I just took that cardstock and put it in my trimmer and trimmed it down a little bit. I think this one I trimmed it down to just over 4 inches by just over 5¼ inches. That image is just a little bit too big to actually get it down to 4 inches by 5¼ without cutting off some of the outside detail. So while I have my machine out, I'm taking the peeled paint distress ink, and I am doing another one with a sentiment with embossing. Now, the one thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to die cut this piece out. So after embossing, I found the matching die, I taped it to there and die cut it. And when I did the die cutting, I lost all of the dimension that you get from doing the embossing. Now, I kept this piece in the video because I wanted to share how I fixed it, or how I tried to fix it, and how that didn't work and what did work. And the main reason for that is just to avoid someone doing what I did and knowing exactly how to fix it. So you can see when I pull out the embossed background, you can see that embossing was completely lost when I did the die cutting. So while in my head I'm still processing and trying to figure out how I'm going to get the look that I am wanting for this particular card, I'm going to take some more white cardstock and I'm going to die cut a piece out of the center. These are going to be the background layer as well as the center layer for this particular card. And what I'm going to do is die cut them, and then I'm going to take my ink pad and I'm going to ink all around it so that I know that matte color is going to match my ink exactly. Another option would be to use colored cardstock and do this with cardstock that completely matches. Sometimes I like to do that. Sometimes I will just do this because I know it's going to work properly. So I'm kind of working on these two cards at once here. They both have very similar techniques to them, but they're just using completely different color schemes and then the different press plates. So for my black and gold card, I am taking a piece of black cardstock and I'm just taking that gold pad and I'm going to use that as a mat behind it. Now, the reason why I didn't want to use gold cardstock for this is because the gold cardstocks that I have are not the same gold tone that this ink is. So this is the easiest way to get a completely perfect matching mat without having to worry about gold colors or the color or what you're seeing right now, the green color, not matching exactly. I already have that cardstock, I already have that ink, so it's an easy way to get matching without even having to think too much about it. And for this particular project, it's also giving me a moment to process and to think about exactly how I want to fix this layer here. So here's where I was trying to fix it the first time. I took those press plates and matched them back up, taped them in place with some yellow tape, and then did my embossing again through the Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. And the embossing stacking that I'm using for both of these is the stacking for embossing a die cut. So I have the base plate A, and then there's plate B, and I can't remember what that one is called. Then I have the rubber embossing mat, and then I have the embossing adapter plate, the gray one. And when I do this, it gives nice pillowy results. However, when I do this to fix it for this particular sentiment, it ends up tearing the cardstock. So it didn't work how I was hoping it would work. However, that piece had to be taped in place so that it wouldn't shift as I was putting my layers together. Again, I'm keeping this in here because I want you to see what I did to try to fix it and how I ended up getting the look that I wanted. So here I'm taking that tape off and I can see that a lot of the areas that the press plate was pushed into have just torn. So it's not really going to work. I do get that texture back in there, but trying to get it out of this cardstock is next to impossible and it just looks horrible. So here's what I do to fix it. I decide I'm going to try die cutting a piece of cardstock with that same die. Then I'm going to place my plates down, ink them, clean off in the background, and try to place that die cut exactly where it needs to be. And this is what ends up working. There's one thing about this that I don't necessarily love, but I do end up getting a similar-ish result to what I'm wanting. So I have this die cut here. What I'm going to do is put those plates in. I'm going to redo my stacking, ink those plates up, put them where I want them to go, and then just carefully place the die cut on top of those inked plates. Now the thing with these inked plates and placing paper and cardstock on top of them is you have to place it perfectly the first time. You can't move anything around or shimmy things around. And you'll also see as I'm moving those inked press plates, I'm doing it from the side. I'm trying not to touch the top, the inked part, because I'm going to remove ink from that. So I don't want to be touching that top part. It has to be done from the side. So I have everything stacked up, put it through the machine again to press that into there. And I do get some beautiful embossed dimension. It's not precisely perfectly placed, but it is the best that I could do. The only thing I don't love about it is you kind of lose the nice die cut edge from the outside of that mirrored arch. But all things considered, I think it was a good solution. So I'm going to put together my black and gold piece here. I put down the black with the gold inked edge down first, and then I am going to glue down my embossed piece. I want to make sure to put a lot of glue there. With an embossed background, you have so much dimension, so you want to make sure that you don't skimp out on the glue so that everything can get glued down properly and have good contact with both the paper and the glue. Now I'm going to put down the background of my green inked piece here, and that inked piece is the same as the card base, so it's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Once I have that down properly, I'm going to put down my embossed piece here. Once again, using that same Barely Art glue for all of these and all of the layers, and then putting down an acrylic block to hold everything in place while I'm applying glue to the next layer. My layered piece here that's inked can also get glued down. I didn't add a lot of extra pieces to this for some background dimension. I kind of thought with the embossed layers that there was enough dimension to it and it didn't really need it. But if you want to, when you're putting your card together, you absolutely can add some layers behind it. It's a great way just to add that dimension, as well as use up cardstock scraps. For the green and white one here, I'm taking some glisten stickles and just glittering, adding some of this glitter glue to some of the flowers. And then because the flowers are only on the top and the bottom, there's one leaf sprig on each side that has kind of round leaves. I also put the glisten stickles in there. You could put it through the whole image, but I kind of thought that would be a little bit too much. I wanted to add just a touch of sparkle, but I didn't want it to be necessarily over the top. The thing to keep in mind when you're adding stickles or glitter glue on top of distress ink or a dye-based ink, dye-based inks are water soluble, so this is going to rehydrate that ink and make it run. So you do need to be careful when you're doing this, and you can see even here how those areas that have the stickles on them are kind of more green. So that ink has already started running. It happens very, very quickly, but it is a way to kind of tie in the stickles with the ink on the card by having it rehydrate and kind of mix into the glitter glue. For the gold and black one, I am taking some nail gems and just putting them in the center of the flowers. If you haven't seen it before, in December I did a stamped gift tag video, and I had discovered that week my daughter was cleaning up her nail supplies and had a container of her nail gems, and I loved the fact that they were so tiny and figured for some things they would be absolutely perfect in card making. So I got myself several different sets. You'll find the links to some of them down in the description below. If you want to put gems on something and want them to be super, super tiny, I've never seen card making gems this tiny. These are perfect for that. I have gotten a set that have 9 different sets in them, and then just some with different colors, but they're a great way you can customize. You can pick and choose. This particular set here that I got these tiny ones out of, that entire container is all the light colored gems, or the white or clear, or whatever you want to call them, in all different sizes. And they're all smaller than, or most of them are smaller than ones that I've seen for card making. So this is a great option if you want really, really tiny gems. Check out nail gems because they don't have any adhesive on them. They're perfect for picking up with these jewel pickers and placing them onto some liquid glue. And I'm using that same Barely Art glue. It works perfect for this as well. I have my Barely Art glue in a really fine tip bottle, so I can get just the tiniest little dot of glue where I want it, and it dries clear. So once this is completely dried, you're not going to see that glue, but it's a perfect way just to add a touch of sparkle to the centers of these flowers. Another option would have been to do some stickles again, but I often like to do different ways of adding sparkle to a card, and these are absolutely perfect for this. They are like the size of a pinhead. They're just the tiniest little things. So once I have all of these gems down, I am going to set this card aside to completely dry, and it really comes together really quite easily putting all of these gems down. What I'll do is do one flower at a time, or with the case of the hydrangeas, I did all of the centers of the flowers, just adding dots of glue, and then just add those gems where all of those dots of glue are. So it happens really, really quick, and the glue, because it's such a minimal amount of glue, the glue ends up drying fairly quickly. So here are the finished and dried cards. Here is the green and white one with the stickles, and then the gold and the black. I absolutely love that gold and the black together. It looks so rich and luxurious looking. So for the next 2 cards, I am going to use some Spellbinders watercolor paper, and I am going to do some watercoloring. I'm going to create 2 cards with this again. They're going to be similar techniques. One of them I will stop at a point, and the second one I'm going to take just a little bit further. So I'm going to do an emboss resist technique with this one. So I'm using some Versamark ink, and this is a clear ink, and I'm going to stamp it on, or press it onto that Spellbinders watercolor cardstock. I'm going to use my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine to do the pressing. And once I pull that clear plate off of the background, I realized I forgot to clean my plates. I typically will try to clean my plates after using them so that they're clean for the next time, but I clearly didn't do this. So I wanted to share this part as well because I wanted to share how I clean my plates off. I just use Ranger Archival Cleaner. It has like a dauber top to it. Rub it all over the plate to release that ink, and then I use a microfiber cloth to clean that off and dry everything off. So once that is cleaned off, dried off, we can repeat this process using that same clear Versamark ink, the same Spellbinders watercolor paper. Now I did emboss that piece and I'll tuck it to the side. I can use it for a future project, so it's not going to go to waste, but you do want to make sure to have clean plates when you're doing this, especially if you're wanting to use clear ink as well as clear embossing powder. If you have any ink on there, it's going to show up. So we'll try that again using the Versamark pad, and we are going to ink it. And I typically, once again, like to ink it twice just to make sure that I don't have any areas that I missed, and then put it through the Platinum 6 machine to press that in. I'm going to cover that background with some clear embossing powder, and I'm going to use my heat tool to melt that powder. You want to make sure that everything is completely covered with that powder. And what this is going to do is we're going to have the look of white or light outlines on this image. It's a little bit of a different look, and just something that's a fun, different way of using these plates. So I have my heat tool here melting the powder, and it's really easy to see when the powder is melted. It goes from matte and granular to clear and shiny. So once I have both of those done, I can start my watercoloring. I'm just using some distress re-inkers to do watercoloring. You can do whatever inks you want with this. I like the distress re-inkers because there's a lot of color in them. You can get really bright colors with it, as well as mix it with a little bit more water and get some really light tones with it. I always have a piece of paper towel or something beside it in order to clean off excess color off my brush or change colors to the next color. The brush that I'm using has water right in the handle, so I don't need to have a jar of water sitting on my desk. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so not having that is perfect. I can just take my brush, squeeze it out on the piece of paper towel, and we'll have a nice clean brush to go into a new color. So the color that I'm using for these flowers, or colors, I'm using spun sugar for the background, and then I'm using picked raspberry for the center. I have a lot of picked raspberry in the little well in my palette, so I am dipping my brush in there and then just wiping it off on my paper towel just so I don't have too much on there. It's much easier to add extra color if needed than it is to take it off. So this way I can kind of control how much color I get on there. And you can see how by having a clear outline to this, or it's basically the color of the background cardstock, you get a completely different look than you do when you have an image that has a black outline to it. So you do definitely want to be doing this on watercolor paper. You can get away with using mixed media heavy stock or mixed media cardstock when doing watercolor, but you want to make sure that you have some sort of paper that can handle that water. I'm just going to go, I'm going to watercolor both of my cardstocks the exact same way, but I am doing a bit of a time lapse to speed things up. Once again, I'm doing 2 different colors for each of the flowers, doing a light color at first, and then I'm taking my darker color and just putting that in where I want the shading or the darkest color. And by having a wet layer with the lightest color and just being able to tap in the darker color, those inks are going to start to flow and blend into each other and kind of naturally create a blend, naturally seep out, well out. So here is the first one there. I can set that aside to dry. Off screen, I did the second one. And here's where I'm going to tweak that second one a little bit. So I'm putting one to the side because I don't want the overspray to this to go on there. I have a mini mister with some water, and I'm just going to take some Perfect Pearls and create a shimmer mist. Now these are the same type of pearls that I used for with the silver where I was doing some watercolor. This time I'm using it in a mister and creating a shimmer spray, and I'm just doing the pearl color. It's not the same silver, but it's the same idea. So this is just going to create an all over shimmer background. Here's the first one with no shimmer, and you can see with this second one when I tilt it into the light that we have a bit of shimmer here. The one thing that I forgot to do when I was doing my watercoloring is I wanted to have a black background here. The first card I did some die cutting or some fussy cutting and then put it onto some black cardstock, and I really liked the look of this. These particular cards, I think they're going to be a lot more striking and more effective if that background is black. So I do want to take the watercolor and watercolor all over that background there. So this one is just the black soot. I'm going to have all of the colors that I used for the whole piece listed in the description. And what I'm trying to do is only doing a little area at a time before dipping it right back in the ink and coloring some more. I'm trying not to dilute this color as much. I want to have it as dark as possible. Another option here would be to use a dye-based marker and do some coloring. That way you wouldn't have to worry about anything being diluted. The only thing you wouldn't want to do here is I wouldn't want to use, say, a Copic marker, because anything that hits that embossing with a permanent pen is going to just color over the embossing. What I'm doing with this is because it's dye ink, it's going to the embossing is going to resist it, and same with a dye ink pen. The embossing will resist that, so you won't be covering up that embossed line. It'll just resist it and kind of wick it away. Sorry, my head gets in the way a little bit here. I was finding it a little bit hard to see some of the lines on the outside, and I was trying to not go over those embossed lines and going into the flowers with the black there. Once this entire outside is watercolored with the black, you do want to make sure to completely let this dry before moving on to the next step. You'll see that I do color in some of the areas inside that would be the color of the background as well. And this background here is the one that I didn't spray with that shimmer spray. When I do this on the one that has the shimmery background, I do rehydrate some of that the Perfect Pearls, the shimmer, and it does mix a little bit in with the black, but it just looks really pretty. It doesn't harm anything or take away from anything in any way. All right, so here are both of the backgrounds painted and dried. You can see there's a couple areas that were shimmery on that second one there that weren't totally dried. So what I'm going to do with that second background is I have a couple pieces of newsprint here. I have a hot iron that the steam is off, and I have it on the highest setting. So what I'm doing is I'm putting it between those newsprints, ironing it, and that's going to remelt that embossing. And we're going to get kind of a look of almost no line watercolor, if you will. It's going to completely remove that embossing, so there's not going to be the shimmer from that or the shine from that, but you will still see the shimmer from the spray that I put all over it. And I just repeat that ironing until I don't see any residue from embossing on the newsprint. Once you're done with this, and I have just sheets of newsprint that I got many, many years ago in the kids coloring section. You could also use some printer paper, but you do want to use a couple sheets. You don't want to start getting that embossing or that melted embossing powder on your iron. So by having a couple sheets, you can make sure it gets absorbed into that paper. I take this and I cut my papers down to just above 4 inches by just above 5 1/4. And the cool thing with this, once you've melted that embossing, it kind of gets a little bit of a batik look to it. You can't really tell when you're doing that, or when someone looks at this, how it was done. It kind of puts a little bit of a mystery on it. So it's one of those ways that I like to step up a background, just because it looks really, really neat without any of those lines there, but you still have that pristine watercolor. Once those are completely trimmed down, I'm going to take that watercolor paper and I'm going to do some more of those press plate sentiments. The ones that I did at the beginning of the video were done on gray Betterpress paper, and this watercolor is a completely different color, so those sentiments aren't going to work for this, but I did want to have those sentiments done and ready just in case I wanted to use them on some cards. So I'm going to repeat what I did at the beginning. I did it off screen because you don't need to see the same thing over again. And I tucked those sentiments to the side. Now I have some layers that I've already cut with those Mirrored Arch labels dies, but I wanted to step up some of these for the second card. So I took some temporary adhesive and I glued my 2 layers together. Now I am putting it in that embossing folder, and this is that Luxe backdrop and our background and border embossing folder, and I put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6. This way both of those pieces are embossed and that embossing matches and lines up. My temporary tape is very old and horrible, so you could see when I was taking it out of that dispenser that it just kind of didn't come out really easily, but it works for what I needed it for this. I wanted to make sure that those layers stayed together and didn't move while I had them in the machine, but I wanted to be able to pull them apart and add extra layers just to give those layers a little bit more dimension and more stability, just like before. So I'm doing the layers for both cards, and you can see that as I'm gluing the next layer, I put the first ones underneath an acrylic block. Let those completely dry. I'm going to take these card backgrounds here and put them onto some white card bases. This is going to make those lines in that embossing just kind of pop, and it's going to bring them out a little bit more. I'm going to put these together in exactly the same way. So both of them are going on white card bases. I'm using that same Barely Art glue, putting acrylic blocks on them to dry while I'm gluing together different layers for on the front of the card. And I did some black layers, or a black layer that coordinates with the background of the card, as well as some really nice bright pink that brings out the pink in some of those flowers. Once I'm done that, I'm going to take those Mother's Day sentiments that I created with the Mother's and Father's Day sentiments press plate and die set, and I'm going to put those on the front of the cards. I chose not to use any of the Father's Day ones for these cards just because they ended up being a little bit more on the feminine side, aside for that one that I did with the silver and gray, but I already had the sentiment done for that. So I wanted to use the sentiment that came with that plate for that particular one. But you could leave that sentiment off and then put one of the Father's Day ones on there if you wanted to. Once I have that sentiment on there, I'm just using a T ruler from Simon Says Snap and just putting that on there to make sure that the sentiment is nice and straight. Some of these sentiments are a little bit harder to tell when they're straight, but these ones have nice flat edges on the bottom, so it does make it a little bit easier. Once I know that they're straight, putting those acrylic blocks right back on them and letting those dry for a few minutes. Here are those cards once those sentiments and those layers have dried. But once again, I'm just going to add some touches of stickles in the centers of the flowers just to add a little bit of sparkle. And I'm going to do that on both of them, even the one that has the shimmer spray background. It just adds a different kind of sparkle to it. And again, these are just tiny dots of the glitter glue, so they're not going to take very, very long to dry. The more you use, the longer this glitter glue stays or takes to dry. And because these flowers were watercolored with some distress reinkers that is dye based, I don't want to be using large amounts of stickles because I don't want them to rehydrate that ink and make it bleed a little bit. So here is the finished card here. This one is the one that is stepped up a little bit. So it has the shimmer spray on the background as well as that embossed layer in the center. And I love how that embossed layer adds so much texture to that center. This is the one where I stopped a little bit ahead. There's no shimmer spray. There's no embossing in the center. Still a beautiful card, but you can see how easy it is to just take a little bit of extra steps and just step it up slightly and how that changes it. This is the one that has the gold ink on that black background and is totally embossed. And then I use the nail gems in the centers of those flowers. And then we have the one that is embossed, but with the green distress ink. Again, very simple, very beautiful, just with that simple color scheme. But by inking the layers for the mattes, you've got a nice coordinated card. This one is the silver and the black one where I use the Perfect Pearls to watercolor in the Mirrored Arch Nested Sprigs plate set. And I love the modern chromatic look on that and how elegant it looks. And there is the first card that I used with the pearlescent chalks. I love how versatile these plates are. We're creating with all of these different cards here. I know this was a long video. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I really appreciate you being here. Have a fantastic day.